My name is Monica. I'm 26 years old and work as a web designer. I grew up in a small rural town with my grandparents, parents, and younger sister, Linda. Life, however, never felt fair. Linda, 7 years younger than me, was always the center of attention. Her opinions carried weight, while mine often went unheard. It was as though I existed in the background, overshadowed by her presence. The favoritism was undeniable. Linda's birthdays were grand affairs, filled with lavish gifts, while mine, falling close to Christmas, were conveniently merged into one occasion, with practical presents like books I had no interest in. When Linda took up soccer, our parents cheered her on at every game and practice, but when I played my final tennis match in middle school, they were too preoccupied driving Linda somewhere to attend. This disparity shaped my childhood, leaving me feeling insignificant and alone, but Linda wasn't oblivious to the injustice. She often spoke up for me when our parents made harsh comparisons. Monica's smart and hardworking. She can do anything, she would insist. After my last tennis match, Linda even handed me a small bouquet of flowers she had picked herself, whispering, "You did great." Our grandparents were also on my side, frequently reprimanding my parents for their bias, but when my grandmother passed away, followed soon after by my grandfather, any protection I had vanished. For a while, Linda continued to defend me, but when my mother began directing her sharp criticisms toward Linda as well, she eventually gave up. "If you're always going to side with your sister, you might as well stand outside with her," my mother would sneer. To spare Linda from our mother's wrath, I told her to stop standing up for me. From that point on, she focused on excelling in academics and sports, molding herself into the daughter our parents could proudly showcase. Meanwhile, I bore the brunt of their disappointment alone. After my grandparents passed, our family's financial situation worsened. My parents told me they couldn't afford to send me to college, crushing my dream of studying design at university. With no other options, I graduated high school and took a job at a small design company far from home. Starting as an office assistant, I dedicated myself to learning from the designers around me. My passion for web design kept me motivated, and I spent weekends taking online courses to sharpen my skills. 3 years later, I was promoted to the design team. 5 years after that, I became a full-fledged web designer, trusted to lead projects. During this time, I rarely visited home. Each trip only served as a painful reminder of my parents' disdain. Instead, I focused entirely on my career. 8 years after high school, I received unexpected news. Linda was preparing for university entrance exams, aiming for a prestigious medical school in the city. Despite everything, I felt proud of her. When she was accepted into her top choice school, I congratulated her warmly. "Linda, that's amazing, you worked so hard, and I admire your dedication," I told her. She thanked me, but there was a hesitation in her voice before she brought up a concern. "The school suggested a donation. It's not mandatory, but Mom and Dad think it'll look bad if we don't contribute. With tuition and living expenses already so high, they don't know what to do." Linda planned to cover her living costs by working part-time, but I could see how much of a burden medical school would be. My parents, unwilling to ask me directly, had pressured Linda into approaching me instead. Their audacity left me speechless. Despite my resentment toward them, I couldn't turn my back on Linda. I decided to help, covering the donation and entrance fees so she could start university without added stress. Linda moved into an apartment near campus, not far from where I lived. I hoped she'd reach out if she ever needed anything, but as she settled into college life, she became distant. Her messages became brief. "I want to eat this," or "I need that, can you get it for me?" She'd text, and I'd arrange whatever she needed. Occasionally, we met for meals, but she remained detached, often preoccupied with her phone. One evening over dinner, I tried to joke lightly. "Mom and Dad probably only care about you," I said with a small smile. Linda's expression turned icy. She scoffed. "Obviously, a medical student like me and a high school graduate designer like you aren't even comparable. No one cares about a job that doesn't need real qualifications." Her words stung like a slap. "There's no need to say it like that," I replied, caught off guard. Linda rolled her eyes. "It's just the truth. Anyone can make a website. If people look you up online, they'd see you have no credentials. You'd be better off getting a real qualification, but I guess that's difficult for someone who only finished high school." I tried to explain. "It's not that simple. I've studied and worked hard to get where I am. You shouldn't judge so easily." Linda let out an irritated sigh, clicking her tongue. "Mom and Dad are right. They always said you're a disappointment, someone who couldn't even get into college. I'm only here because they told me to keep an eye on you, to make sure you don't embarrass us even more. I froze, her words sinking deep. Memories of my parents' constant comparisons came rushing back. Linda is smart, kind, and dependable, while Monica is slow, clumsy, and useless. I lowered my head, my chest tightening as if the air had been knocked out of me. Seeing my silence, Linda misinterpreted it as shame. She smirked and stood up. Well, I'm heading home now. Then, without another glance, she left. Living on her own had changed Linda. Surrounded by exceptional peers and basking in our parents' approval, she had fully embraced her role as the family's pride and joy, a future doctor. Meanwhile, their disappointment in me had seeped into her words, her tone, and her attitude, as if she had absorbed their scorn entirely. That winter, I reluctantly returned home for the holidays. My parents had asked me to come back with Linda, who hadn't visited since starting university. From the moment we arrived, it was obvious where everyone's attention was directed. The dining table was loaded with steaks, pizza, and every imaginable indulgence, all in honor of Linda's visit. That evening, the house buzzed with guests, neighbors, relatives, even Linda's old classmates, gathered for a grand celebration. She reveled in the admiration, proudly sharing stories about her life at university. Mom keeps begging me to visit more often, she said with a chuckle, but with the demands of the country's top medical school, it's tough. Between team projects and demanding professors, I barely have time to breathe. While she soaked in the attention, I kept myself busy in the kitchen, content to stay in the background. Still, her voice carried through every room, drawing eager responses from our parents and relatives. I couldn't help but notice the forced smiles of some guests, as if they sensed the arrogance beneath her words. As I stepped into the room with a tray of wine, an elderly neighbor attempted to shift the focus. "Monica, aren't you working in design? How's that going?" Before I could respond, my parents interjected dismissively. "Oh, there's nothing much to say about her," my mother said flatly. "She didn't even go to college, such a disappointment." An uneasy silence settled over the room. Many of those present hadn't attended college themselves, instead dedicating their lives to work and family, yet no one dared to challenge my parents' harsh words. Meanwhile, Linda and my parents carried on, oblivious to the insult they had just delivered. Feeling humiliated, I retreated, but Linda intercepted me. "You still come home a lot, don't you, Monica? I guess you don't have much else going on, that's why you're so bold," she teased, laughing. My parents joined in. "Don't push too hard, Linda," my father said with mock concern. "You might hurt her feelings." Poor Monica. Frustration boiled inside me, clenching my fists. I forced out the words, "Maybe I shouldn't come back next year." "I get it." Relatives exchanged uneasy glances, but I ignored them. I placed the tray on the table, grabbed my coat and bag, and headed for the door. Linda smirked as I passed her. "Fine by me," she said with a casual wave. "Don't bother coming back." My parents didn't stop me. "Don't make such a big deal out of it," my father muttered. With my heart pounding, I stepped into the cold night air. I didn't look back as I made my way to the station, pushing down the storm of emotions inside me. Visiting home had always been painful, but I had convinced myself that familial obligation outweighed my personal feelings. This time, however, Linda's cruelty cemented my decision. If I valued my self-respect, I needed to walk away, for good. Months passed in silence. Then, one day, my phone rang. Seeing Linda's name flash on the screen, I hesitated before silencing the call, but she was persistent, leaving message after message, urging me to pick up. Finally, I gave in. "Did you pay my tuition?" she asked urgently, her voice carrying an air of entitlement, as if nothing had changed. "I already covered the entrance fee and donation when you enrolled," I said calmly. "What about this year's tuition?" "The university says it's due," she pressed. "I don't know anything about that." Even through the phone, I could sense her discomfort. I had drained my savings to cover her initial costs, her entrance fee, the hefty donation, and her first year of tuition. At the time, I had assumed it was a temporary act of support, never imagining my family saw it as an indefinite obligation. But after last year's incident, I had no intention of continuing to fund Linda's education. "I helped you because I wanted to," I said firmly. "Did Mom and Dad send you to an expensive out-of-state university knowing they couldn't afford it?" "That's not it," Linda stammered. "I have wealthy friends, so there are extra expenses beyond tuition." Mom and Dad somehow managed those, but now they don't have the money for tuition. That's why they told me to call you. Realization hit me. My parents had likely assumed from the beginning that I would shoulder the cost indefinitely. By now, I had advanced in my career, securing a position at a major design firm with a significantly higher salary, but the financial burden was never meant to be mine alone. It was clear that the money intended for Linda's education had been squandered on luxuries. A few days later, my parents called, demanding I cover Linda's tuition. Their entitled tone only deepened my resentment. To them, I wasn't family, I was just a source of money. Their complete lack of respect made my decision easy. Linda bombarded me with messages, each more desperate than the last. If you don't pay, I'll be expelled. Scholarships and part-time work aren't enough. It would be such a waste if someone as talented as me had to drop out. I promise I'll pay you back, just help me as family. She even tried to manipulate me with, if you're mad about what happened, I can try to convince Mom and Dad to let you come home. I saved her voicemails in a separate folder, deleted everything else, and blocked her number. No one should be treated as a doormat, family or not. Later, I heard through relatives that Linda eventually secured scholarships and loans for her tuition, but without financial support for living expenses. She took on part-time work. The strain of balancing studies and work proved too much, and she failed several courses. Eventually, she dropped out entirely and moved back home. With their finances depleted, my parents couldn't afford to send her elsewhere. Linda refused to work locally, instead spending her days gaming and taking out her frustration on our parents. A friend who lived nearby later told me their household had become a battleground, with frequent, heated arguments. My parents, once so proud of Linda, were powerless to rein her in. Things only deteriorated further. Under immense stress, my father became embroiled in a scandal after being accused of inappropriate behavior on public transit. Though no formal charges were filed, he resigned in disgrace. My mother, with no work experience, struggled to find employment. Desperate, they attempted to reach me through distant relatives, but their messages remained unchanged, entitled demands without a shred of remorse. Eventually, even those relatives lost patience with them. Don't worry about it, we'll handle things here, one said, cutting off further attempts at contact. Through word of mouth, I later learned that Linda and my father, both jobless, were now living in near destitution. My mother, overwhelmed, had left them behind. With no goodwill left in the community, they found no helping hands extended their way. Meanwhile, my life flourished. My design career had taken off, leading to a prestigious project that earned industry-wide recognition. With the project wrapping up and my savings secure, I finally pursued a long-held dream, preparing for university entrance exams. I planned to study business management, with the ultimate goal of becoming independent. For the first time in years, I felt excitement for what lay ahead.